The summer of 1889 brought more than just scorching heat to the dusty town of Copper Ridge, Arizona. It brought Charlotte Whitmore face to face with a choice that would transform her from a struggling frontier nurse into the wealthiest woman in American history. When a bleeding stranger collapsed on her doorstep during a thunderstorm, she had no idea he carried secrets worth more than all the gold in California. What began as a simple act of medical mercy would unleash a chain of events involving buried treasure, railroad fortunes, and a love story that defied every convention of the American West. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless Arizona sun beat down on Copper Ridge like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering mirage of heat waves and desperation. Charlotte Whitmore pressed a damp cloth to her forehead as she emerged from the ramshackle building that served as the town's only medical clinic. Her starched white apron already wilted from the oppressive temperature that hadn't dropped below 90 degrees in 3 weeks. At 28, Charlotte possessed the kind of practical beauty that frontier life demanded. Strong hands capable of setting bones, intelligent green eyes that could assess a patient's condition at a glance, and auburn hair she kept severely pinned, despite its tendency to escape in rebellious curls around her temples. She had arrived in Copper Ridge 5 years earlier with nothing but a worn leather medical bag inherited from her father and a determination to practice medicine in a place where doctors were as rare as honest politicians. The town itself perched precariously on the edge of nowhere, a collection of weathered wooden buildings and sun-baked adobe structures that had sprung up around a moderately successful copper mine. The mine provided enough prosperity to keep the town alive, but not enough to attract the kind of sophisticated medical professionals who preferred the comfort of eastern cities. For Charlotte, this isolation represented opportunity rather than hardship. Her clinic occupied the ground floor of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, an arrangement that provided her with both living quarters upstairs and a steady stream of patients suffering from everything from mining accidents to the various ailments that plagued frontier communities. The work was demanding and often dangerous. She had treated everything from gunshot wounds to typhoid fever, but it had given her something precious: independence. Unlike most women of her era, Charlotte answered to no husband, father, or male guardian. She earned her own money, made her own decisions, and had built a reputation throughout the territory as a skilled healer who could be trusted with the most delicate medical situations. The arrangement suited her perfectly, even if it meant enduring the occasional disapproving glance from more conventional townsfolk who believed unmarried women belonged safely under male protection. The late afternoon heat had driven most of Copper Ridge's inhabitants indoors, leaving the streets nearly deserted, except for a few hardy souls brave enough to venture out. Charlotte paused on the clinic's wooden sidewalk, surveying the quiet scene while mentally cataloguing her supplies. She needed to place another order for laudanum. The miners went through enormous quantities of the painkiller, and her stock of clean bandages was running dangerously low. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, though the sky remained a merciless blue dome overhead. Charlotte lifted her eyes toward the western horizon, where dark clouds were building with the promise of one of Arizona's spectacular but brief summer storms. The thought of rain brought a smile to her lips. Anything that might break this suffocating heat would be welcome. She was about to return inside when the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught her attention. A single horse was moving up the main street at an unsteady pace, its rider hunched forward in the saddle in a way that immediately triggered Charlotte's medical instincts. Even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. The horse was a magnificent black stallion, clearly a valuable animal, but it moved with the uncertain gait of a mount whose rider was no longer in full control. As the pair drew closer, Charlotte could make out more details that deepened her concern. The rider wore a long brown duster that hung open, revealing a white shirt stained dark with what could only be blood. His hat sat askew on dark hair, and his left hand gripped the saddle horn with the desperate intensity of a man fighting to remain conscious. The horse came to a halt directly in front of the clinic, as if the animal possessed some instinct for finding help. For a moment, the rider remained motionless in the saddle, swaying slightly with exhaustion. Then, without warning, he pitched forward and tumbled to the dusty ground with a sickening thud. Charlotte was moving before her conscious mind had fully processed what she had witnessed. Years of frontier medicine had trained her to react to medical emergencies with swift efficiency, and this was clearly a case requiring immediate intervention. She knelt beside the fallen man, her experienced hands already assessing his condition. Even as she called out for assistance, "Mrs. Henderson, Martha, I need help getting a patient inside." The man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Charlotte's initial examination revealed a bullet wound in his left shoulder, still bleeding steadily, though not with the bright arterial flow that would indicate an immediately life-threatening injury. More concerning was his obvious state of exhaustion and dehydration. His lips were cracked, his skin hot and dry to the touch, suggesting he had been riding hard under the brutal sun for hours or perhaps days. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the clinic door, her normally stern expression replaced by practical concern. Martha Sullivan, the young woman who helped with the boarding house's daily operations, emerged behind her, already rolling up her sleeves in preparation for whatever assistance might be needed. "Gunshot wound," Charlotte announced tersely as they worked together to lift the unconscious man. He was tall and solidly built, making the task challenging even with 3 women working in coordination. "Get him to the examination table. Martha, I'll need hot water and clean towels immediately." They managed to half-carry, half-drag the stranger inside and onto the sturdy wooden table that served as Charlotte's primary surgical surface. In the better light of the clinic, she could make a more thorough assessment of her unexpected patient. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, with strong, angular features and skin weathered by years of outdoor living. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and several days' worth of beard stubble covered his jaw. His clothes were well-made but travel-worn, expensive boots, quality fabric in his shirt and trousers, and a gun belt with a holster that showed the kind of wear that came from regular use. Most intriguingly, he wore no obvious identification, no badge or papers visible in his pockets, and no distinguishing marks that might indicate his profession or allegiance. In a territory where men's identities were often as fluid as shifting sand, this wasn't particularly unusual, but something about this particular stranger struck Charlotte as significant. The bullet wound was her immediate concern. The slug had entered his shoulder from behind and slightly to the right, suggesting he had been shot while either running away or riding hard. The trajectory and powder burns around the entry wound indicated the shot had come from some distance. This wasn't the result of a close-quarters fight, but rather someone taking careful aim at a moving target. Working with practiced efficiency, Charlotte cut away the blood-stained shirt to better access the wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through the muscle without striking bone, which was fortunate. However, the continued bleeding and the obvious signs of infection around the entry and exit wounds indicated that the injury was several days old and had not received proper medical attention. "Martha, I'll need my surgical instruments sterilized," Charlotte instructed as she continued her examination. "Mrs. Henderson, could you prepare a bed in the spare room upstairs? This gentleman is going to need several days of care before he's fit to travel." As she worked to clean and treat the wound, Charlotte found herself studying her patient's face more closely. There was something compelling about his features, an intensity that persisted even in unconsciousness, as if whatever force had driven him to her door remained active even while his body surrendered to exhaustion. His hands, she noticed, were particularly telling. They bore the calluses of a man accustomed to hard work and the handling of firearms, but they also showed signs of more refined activities. His fingernails were clean and well maintained, and there were no obvious scars or marks that would suggest a lifetime of brutal manual labor. These were the hands of a man who had known both genteel society and rougher circumstances. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally arrived just as Charlotte finished suturing the wound. Lightning illuminated the clinic windows in brilliant flashes, while thunder shook the building's wooden frame. Rain began to fall in heavy drops that quickly escalated to a torrential downpour, drumming against the roof with enough force to make conversation difficult. "Perfect timing," Martha observed as she helped Charlotte bandage the cleaned wound. "If he'd collapsed out there in this weather—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Men had been known to drown in Arizona's flash floods, and an unconscious person caught in such a storm would have faced almost certain death. Charlotte stepped back to evaluate her handiwork. The wound was properly cleaned and dressed, and she had administered enough laudanum to ensure the patient would rest comfortably through the night. His color was already improving, and his breathing had become deeper and more regular. With proper care and adequate rest, he should make a full recovery within a week or two. But as she cleaned her instruments and organized her medical supplies, Charlotte found herself puzzling over the mystery her patient presented. Who was he? What circumstances had led to his being shot and forced to ride hard across the desert in dangerous conditions? And perhaps most intriguingly, why had his magnificent horse seemed to know exactly where to find help? Mrs. Henderson returned from preparing the upstairs room, her expression thoughtful. "That's a valuable animal he was riding," she observed quietly. "Not the kind of horse a drifter or common criminal would own. And his clothes, they're expensive. Good quality fabric, custom, tailoring." Charlotte nodded, having made similar observations. "His gun belt shows significant wear, but it's also high-quality leather. Well-maintained weapons. This isn't someone who's been living rough by choice." "Could be a lawman," Martha suggested. "Hopefully. A sheriff or marshal who got caught up in some trouble. Or he could be the trouble himself," Mrs. Henderson countered with characteristic pragmatism. "We don't know anything about him except that someone thought he was worth shooting." The observation struck Charlotte as both accurate and irrelevant. Regardless of her patient's background or the circumstances that had brought him to her door, her professional obligations were clear. She was a doctor, the only medical professional for 50 miles in any direction, and he was a seriously injured man who would die without proper care. Until he recovers enough to tell us who he is and what happened, our responsibility is straightforward, she declared with finality. We provide medical care and ask questions later. The three women worked together to transport the unconscious man upstairs to the small spare room Mrs. Henderson maintained for guests. The space was spartanly furnished, but clean and comfortable, with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the town's main street. Charlotte positioned him carefully to avoid putting pressure on his wounded shoulder, then arranged her medical supplies on the washstand, where she could easily access them for regular wound care. As the storm raged outside, Charlotte maintained her vigil beside the bed, checking her patient's vital signs and adjusting his position as needed. His fever had broken sometime after midnight, and by dawn he was sleeping naturally rather than lying in the unnatural stillness of unconsciousness. The morning brought clear skies and air that felt almost cool after weeks of oppressive heat. Charlotte was changing the bandages on his shoulder wound when her patient finally stirred, his dark eyes opening slowly as consciousness returned. He remained motionless for several minutes, apparently assessing his surroundings and situation with the caution of a man accustomed to waking up in unfamiliar places. When his gaze finally settled on Charlotte's face, she was struck by the intelligence and wariness she saw there. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse from dehydration and disuse. "Copper Ridge, Arizona," Charlotte replied professionally. "You're in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. I'm Charlotte Whitmore, and I've been treating your gunshot wound." He attempted to sit up, then winced as the movement pulled at his sutures. Charlotte gently but firmly pressed him back against the pillows. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You need to remain still for at least another day," she instructed. "The bullet passed clean through, but you've lost a considerable amount of blood and your body needs time to heal." "How long have I been here?" he asked, accepting her medical authority without argument. 2 days. You collapsed outside my clinic during the thunderstorm." Charlotte studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or evasion. "You were in pretty bad shape, dehydrated, exhausted, and the wound had started to fester. Another few hours, and you might not have made it." Something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "I remember the storm starting, but not much after that." "My horse?" "Fine. We put him in Murphy's stable down the street. Beautiful animal. He seems to have known exactly where to bring you for help." A small smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Midnight's always been smarter than most people give horses credit for." Charlotte waited for him to volunteer additional information about himself, but he remained silent, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts or circumstances. After several minutes of awkward silence, she decided to address the situation directly. "I'll need a name for my medical records," she said matter-of-factly, "and eventually someone's going to need to know what happened to you. Sheriff Morrison will probably want to ask some questions once word gets around that there's been a shooting." The mention of the local sheriff caused an almost imperceptible tightening around her patient's eyes, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "James," he said finally. "James Connor." Charlotte suspected this wasn't his real name, but she made a note in her records without comment. In frontier communities, men often carried multiple identities for various reasons, and it wasn't her place to challenge a patient's choice of what to call himself. "Well, Mr. Connor, you're welcome to stay here until you're fully recovered. Mrs. Henderson charges reasonable rates for room and board, and I'll continue to change your dressings and monitor your progress." "That's very kind of you, Miss Doctor Whitmore," Charlotte corrected gently but firmly. "I studied medicine at Johns Hopkins before coming west." This revelation clearly surprised him, though he recovered quickly. "My apologies, Dr. Whitmore. I wasn't expecting to find such qualified medical care in a place like Copper Ridge." "Most people don't," Charlotte acknowledged, "which is precisely why I came here. The frontier needs medical professionals, and I prefer working where I can make a real difference." Over the following days, as James Connor's strength gradually returned, Charlotte found herself drawn into increasingly lengthy conversations with her mysterious patient. He proved to be intelligent, well-educated, and surprisingly knowledgeable about subjects ranging from literature to mining engineering to the complex political dynamics of territorial governance. Despite his obvious education and refinement, he also demonstrated practical knowledge that could only have come from extensive experience with frontier life. He could discuss the best techniques for tracking game through difficult terrain, the relative merits of different firearms for various purposes, and the subtle signs that indicated when a mining claim might prove profitable. Most intriguingly, he seemed to possess detailed knowledge of the region's geography that went far beyond what a casual traveler might acquire. He could describe remote water sources, hidden passes through the mountains, and abandoned settlements with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time exploring Arizona Territory's most isolated areas. When Charlotte mentioned this observation, James explained that he had worked as a surveyor and geological consultant, traveling throughout the Southwest to assess mining prospects for various investors. It was a plausible explanation that accounted for both his education and his practical knowledge, though Charlotte sensed there were aspects of his background he wasn't sharing. The mystery deepened when Sheriff Morrison finally arrived to investigate the shooting. The lawman was a competent but unimaginative peace officer who had maintained order in Copper Ridge through a combination of common sense and an unwillingness to look too deeply into matters that didn't directly threaten the town's stability. "Heard you had some excitement the other night," Morrison said as he entered the clinic, his badge gleaming dully in the afternoon sunlight. "Man with a gunshot wound, word is." "That's correct," Charlotte confirmed. "He's recovering upstairs. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but he needed several days of care. Mind if I ask him a few questions? Like to know who's doing the shooting in my territory." Charlotte had no legal grounds to refuse the sheriff's request, and she escorted Morrison upstairs to where James Connor was sitting up in bed, reading one of the medical journals she had loaned him. He looked up as they entered, his expression politely attentive but revealing nothing. "Mr. Connor, this is Sheriff Morrison." Charlotte made the introductions. "He'd like to ask you about your shooting." Morrison nodded perfunctorily and got straight to business. "Where did this happen, and who did it?" James met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "About 30 miles northeast of here, near Skeleton Canyon. I was camping for the night when someone took a shot at me from the rocks above. Never got a clear look at who it was." "What were you doing out that way? Not exactly a popular camping spot." "I'm a geological surveyor. I was examining some mineral deposits for potential investors." Morrison's expression suggested he found this explanation acceptable, if unremarkable. "You have any idea why someone might want to shoot you?" "Could have been bandits looking for easy money," James suggested with a shrug. "Or maybe just someone who doesn't like strangers in what they consider their territory. Hard to say." The sheriff asked a few more routine questions, received similarly vague but plausible answers, and eventually departed with the air of a man who had fulfilled his official obligations without uncovering anything particularly interesting. Charlotte was struck by how effortlessly James had provided responses that were technically truthful, while revealing virtually nothing of substance about his actual circumstances. That evening, as Charlotte changed his bandages one final time, before he would be fit to travel, she decided to address her growing curiosity directly. "You know, Mr. Connor, in all the years I've been practicing medicine, I've developed a pretty good sense for when people aren't telling me the complete truth about their circumstances." James looked up at her with mild interest. "And what does your medical intuition tell you about me, Dr. Whitmore?" "It tells me that you're not a geological surveyor, that James Connor probably isn't your real name, and that the circumstances of your shooting were considerably more complicated than a simple case of mistaken identity or bad luck." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her wonder what conclusions he might be drawing about her character and motivations. "What makes you think that?" he asked finally. Charlotte set down her medical instruments and gave him her full attention. "Several things. Your hands show extensive calluses from handling firearms, but not the kind of wear patterns you'd expect from someone who spends most of his time with surveying equipment. Your knowledge of the local geography is far more detailed than what a casual surveyor would acquire, especially in areas that don't show obvious mining potential. And your reaction when I mentioned Sheriff Morrison suggested you were concerned about more than just routine questioning." James smiled, and for the first time since he had arrived, the expression seemed completely genuine. "You're very observant, Dr. Whitmore." It comes with the profession, so am I right? About which part? Any of it. All of it. He was quiet again, apparently weighing how much truth he was willing to share. Finally, he reached a decision. My name really is James, though Connor is borrowed from an old friend who won't be needing it anymore. You're correct that I'm not a surveyor, at least not primarily. And yes, the circumstances of my shooting were more complicated than I told Sheriff Morrison. Charlotte waited for him to continue, but he seemed to have reached the limit of what he was prepared to reveal. That's all you're going to tell me, she asked. For now, it's all I can tell you. But I want you to know that I'm genuinely grateful for everything you've done. You saved my life, and I won't forget that kindness. There was something in his tone that suggested this conversation was meant to serve as a farewell, and Charlotte realized he was planning to leave Copperidge as soon as he was physically able. You don't have to rush off, she said, surprised by her reluctance to see him go. You're welcome to stay until you're completely recovered. I appreciate that, but staying longer would only put you and Mrs. Henderson at risk. The people who shot me aren't going to stop looking. And when they pick up my trail again, I don't want to be anywhere near innocent people who might get hurt. The admission confirmed Charlotte's suspicions that James Connor, or whatever his real name might be, was involved in something far more dangerous and complex than he had initially indicated. But rather than alarming her, this revelation only intensified her curiosity about the mysterious circumstances that had brought him into her life. What if I told you I'm not particularly concerned about the risk? She said impulsively. James studied her face with renewed interest. Why would you say that? Charlotte wasn't entirely sure herself. There was something about this enigmatic stranger that intrigued her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Perhaps it was his obvious intelligence and education, so rare in frontier communities. Perhaps it was the way he treated her medical expertise with genuine respect rather than the skepticism many men displayed toward women in professional roles. Or perhaps it was simply the mystery he represented, the sense that he carried secrets that might prove far more interesting than the routine medical cases that typically occupied her days. I don't know, she admitted honestly. But I have the feeling that whatever trouble you're involved in, it's more complex than simple criminality, and I find myself curious about the complete story. Curiosity can be dangerous, Dr. Whitmore. So can boredom, Mr. Connor, and I've been finding life in Copperidge rather predictable lately. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition, perhaps, that they were now speaking more honestly than they had since he regained consciousness. What would you say if I told you that the complete story involves enough stolen money to make us both rich beyond imagining, but that recovering it would require taking risks that could easily get us both killed? Charlotte felt her pulse quicken, though whether from excitement or apprehension she couldn't say. I'd say that sounds like the most interesting proposition anyone's made to me in years. James Connor smiled again, and this time the expression held a hint of something that might have been relief. In that case, Dr. Whitmore, I think it's time I told you who I really am and why someone was willing to shoot me to prevent me from reaching a certain location about 100 miles south of here. Thunder rumbled again in the distance, though the sky remained clear. Charlotte realized that another storm was approaching Copper Ridge, though this one promised to bring changes far more significant than merely breaking the summer heat. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the walls of the small room as James sat up straighter in bed, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flame. Charlotte pulled the wooden chair closer, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal would fundamentally alter her understanding of the situation she had stumbled into. My real name is James Blackwood, he began, his voice carrying a gravity that hadn't been present in their previous conversations. 3 months ago, I was a respected member of Denver society, part owner of the Rocky Mountain Mining Consortium, engaged to the daughter of Colorado's territorial governor, and widely regarded as one of the most promising young businessmen in the West. Charlotte felt her eyebrows rise in surprise. This wasn't the background she had expected from a man who had arrived at her clinic with a bullet wound and an obvious familiarity with life on the run. "What happened?" she asked, settling back in her chair to listen. James's expression darkened, with what appeared to be a mixture of anger and pain. "I discovered that my business partner, Harrison Vale, had been systematically embezzling funds from our mining operations and using our company's reputation to defraud investors throughout Colorado and Wyoming. When I confronted him with the evidence, he claimed it was all a misunderstanding that could be easily resolved." He paused, running his fingers through his dark hair in a gesture that suggested the memory still troubled him deeply. 2 days later, I found myself framed for the very crimes Vale had been committing. Forged documents appeared showing my signature on fraudulent investment contracts. Witnesses came forward claiming they had seen me at meetings I had never attended. Money that Vale had stolen was discovered in an account bearing my name. "How is that possible?" Charlotte asked, though she was beginning to understand why James had been reluctant to provide his real identity to Sheriff Morrison. "Vale had powerful friends in both business and government circles," James explained bitterly. "Men who had profited from his schemes and had strong motivations to ensure the blame fell elsewhere. Within a week, warrants had been issued for my arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and theft totaling over $200,000. The figure was staggering, more money than most people in the territory would see in several lifetimes. Charlotte tried to comprehend the scope of the conspiracy James was describing. "But surely you had allies of your own, people who knew your character and could vouch for your integrity." A bitter laugh escaped James's lips. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? But when a man is accused of stealing that much money, even close friends begin to question everything they thought they knew about him. My fiancé broke our engagement the day after the warrants were issued. My banker froze my personal accounts pending investigation. Business associates who had considered me a trusted partner suddenly found excuses to avoid being seen in my company." Charlotte was beginning to appreciate the magnitude of the trap that had been set for him. "So you ran." "I had no choice." Vale's influence extended into law enforcement circles. I had reason to believe that if I allowed myself to be arrested, I might never live to stand trial. So yes, I ran, but not before conducting some investigation of my own. This was clearly the crucial part of the story, and Charlotte leaned forward with growing anticipation. "I spent 2 months following Vale's trail, piecing together the full scope of his operations. What I discovered was far more extensive than simple embezzlement. Vale hadn't just been stealing from our company, he had been operating an elaborate scheme involving multiple mining ventures, railroad investments, and territorial land deals." James reached under his pillow and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed and worn from constant handling. "Everything I learned is documented here. Names, dates, amounts, locations where stolen funds were hidden. But the most important discovery was this: Vale didn't spend the money he stole. He converted it to gold and silver, then buried it in various locations throughout Arizona and New Mexico territories." Charlotte felt her pulse quicken as the implications began to dawn on her. "You know where the treasure is hidden." "Not all of it, but enough. My investigation led me to believe that Vale established at least 7 major cache sites, each containing between $20,000 and $50,000 worth of precious metals and currency. I managed to locate 3 of the sites before Vale's men caught up with me." "The men who shot you?" "Exactly. Vale hired a team of professional gunmen to track me down and recover this journal. They've been pursuing me across half the Southwest. For the past month, I thought I had lost them in the desert near Tucson, but they picked up my trail again just north of here." Charlotte examined the journal James offered to her, noting the meticulous handwriting and detailed maps sketched in the margins. Even a cursory glance revealed the painstaking research that had gone into documenting Vale's criminal enterprise. "This represents months of dangerous investigation," she observed, impressed by the thoroughness of his documentation. "Nearly got me killed on several occasions," James confirmed. "But it also represents something else. Proof of my innocence and the means to recover enough stolen funds to restore my reputation and rebuild my life. And make us both incredibly wealthy in the process." "That too," he acknowledged, with a slight smile. "The cache sites I've already located contain an estimated $120,000 in gold and silver coins. The 4 remaining sites, based on the patterns I've identified in Vale's operations, likely contain at least twice that amount." Charlotte set the journal down carefully, her mind racing through the implications of what James had just revealed. She was looking at the potential for wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. Enough money to establish the finest medical practice in any city she chose, to fund research into new treatments, to live in comfort and luxury for the rest of her life. But she was also looking at enormous risk. If James was telling the truth about Vale's hired gunman, then simply possessing this information made her a target for violence from professional killers. And if he was lying, if this entire story was an elaborate deception designed to secure her cooperation in some criminal scheme, then she was contemplating participation in activities that could destroy her career and land her in prison. "I need to ask you something directly," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "How do I know you're telling me the truth? How do I know you're not the criminal Vale claims you are, and this isn't all an elaborate story to convince me to help you? Recover money you actually stole?" James nodded approvingly, as if pleased by her skepticism. "That's exactly the question you should ask. And I can prove my innocence, though doing so will require trusting me long enough to examine the evidence." He gestured toward the journal. "Look at the handwriting in Vale's personal correspondence, which I managed to obtain copies of. Compare it to the forged documents that supposedly bear my signature. You'll see that they're written by the same hand. Vale forged my signature on contracts I never saw." Charlotte examined the samples he indicated, noting subtle similarities in letter formation and pen pressure that suggested they had indeed been written by the same person. "More importantly," James continued, "consider the dates and locations. According to the charges against me, I was supposedly conducting fraudulent negotiations in Santa Fe. At the same time, I was documented as being in Denver attending my father's funeral. The timeline is impossible. No one could have been in both places at the same time." She spent the next hour reviewing the evidence James had compiled, cross-referencing dates and locations, studying handwriting samples and financial records. Gradually, a picture emerged of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by someone with significant resources and careful planning. "This is incredibly detailed work," she said finally, closing the journal. "If you fabricated all of this, you're either the most meticulous criminal in American history, or you've spent an enormous amount of effort creating false evidence to support a lie that would be easily disproven in court." "Which brings us back to the central question," James said. "Are you willing to help me recover the stolen funds and clear my name? Because I can't do it alone, and after what you've done to save my life, you're the only person I trust." Charlotte rose from her chair and moved to the window, staring out at the quiet street below, while she considered her options. The safe choice would be to wish James well, send him on his way, and return to her predictable but secure life as Copper Ridge's only doctor. She could continue treating mining accidents and frontier ailments, gradually building a modest practice that would provide comfortable but unremarkable security. The alternative was to embrace the extraordinary opportunity James was offering, to help him recover a fortune in stolen treasure while clearing his name and bringing a genuine criminal to justice. The potential rewards were staggering, but so were the risks. Vale's hired gunmen wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who stood between them and the information they sought. "Tell me about the practical aspects," she said, turning back to face him. "How exactly would we go about recovering this treasure? What would my role be in this endeavor?" James's expression grew more animated as he sensed her growing interest in the proposition. "The nearest cache site is about 3 days' ride south of here, in a canyon near the Mexican border. According to my research, Vale buried approximately $30,000 worth of gold coins there, along with documentation that could prove his guilt in several major fraud cases. And you know exactly where to look? Within a few hundred yards?" Yes, Vale was methodical in his approach. He chose locations that were distinctive enough to relocate easily, but remote enough to avoid accidental discovery. "This particular site is near a distinctive rock formation that I sketched from his private notes." Charlotte found herself intrigued by the logistics involved. What would we need for such an expedition? Supplies, equipment, transportation, basic camping gear, food for a week, proper tools for excavation, and firearms for protection, James replied, clearly having thought through these requirements in detail. "Your medical skills could prove invaluable if we encounter difficulties, and your knowledge of the territory would help us avoid populated areas where we might be recognized." "My knowledge of the territory is limited to areas around Copper Ridge," Charlotte pointed out. "I've never traveled as far south as the Mexican border. But you understand frontier survival better than most people, and you're accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure. Those qualities matter more than specific geographic knowledge." Charlotte appreciated his confidence in her abilities, though she wondered if he fully understood what he was asking of her. She had spent years building her reputation as a respectable medical professional in a conservative frontier community. Disappearing for a week or more on a treasure-hunting expedition with a man wanted by territorial authorities could destroy everything she had worked to achieve. "What about my practice here?" she asked. "I can't simply abandon my patients without explanation, and Mrs. Henderson would be scandalized if I disappeared with a man she considers a dangerous stranger." "We could claim you're traveling to Tucson to attend a medical conference," James suggested. "It's a plausible explanation that would account for a week's absence without raising too many questions. And what if something goes wrong? What if Vale's men find us, or we encounter other dangers? What if this entire enterprise proves to be based on false information?" James was quiet for a moment, apparently recognizing the gravity of what he was asking her to risk. "I won't lie to you about the dangers involved. Vale's men are experienced killers who won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their employer's interests. The terrain we'll be traveling through is harsh and unforgiving, populated by rattlesnakes, scorpions, and occasionally hostile Apache bands." He met her eyes directly. "But I also believe this represents the opportunity of a lifetime, not just for the wealth we could recover, but for the chance to bring genuine criminals to justice and clear my name in the process. How often do any of us get the chance to right a significant wrong while securing our financial futures?" Charlotte walked to the washstand and splashed cool water on her face, using the moment to organize her thoughts. Everything James had told her sounded plausible, and the evidence he had shown her supported his claims of innocence. More importantly, her instincts suggested he was telling the truth about both his identity and his circumstances. But instincts could be wrong, and the stakes involved were enormous. She was contemplating risking not just her reputation and career, but potentially her life, based on the word of a man she had known for less than a week. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "This isn't the kind of decision I can make impulsively." "Of course," James agreed readily. "But I should tell you that time is a luxury we may not have much of. Vale's men are persistent, and they're probably no more than a day or two behind me. If we're going to do this, we need to leave soon." The pressure of the timeline added another layer of complexity to Charlotte's decision-making process. She was being asked to commit to an extraordinary venture with minimal time for reflection or consultation with others she trusted. "Assuming I decided to help you," she said carefully, "what guarantee would I have that you'd honor whatever agreement we made about sharing the recovered funds?" "Beyond my word, you'd have possession of half the journal's contents," James replied. "I'd give you detailed maps to 3 of the cache sites, while keeping the information about the other 4. We'd be mutually dependent. Neither of us could succeed without the other's cooperation." It was a reasonable arrangement that demonstrated his understanding of her need for security in their partnership. Charlotte found herself impressed by his willingness to share both the risks and the potential. "Rewards equitably, and after we recover the treasure, what then? We establish documentation of Vale's crimes, present the evidence to territorial authorities, and work to have the charges against me dismissed. The recovered funds would be divided according to whatever agreement we establish beforehand." "What percentage would you consider fair?" James smiled. "Given that you'd be risking everything to help me, and that your medical expertise could prove essential to our success, I'd propose an even split, 50-50 partnership in all recovered assets." The offer was more generous than Charlotte had expected. Though she realized that James probably understood, he had little choice but to offer attractive terms if he hoped to secure her cooperation. "I'll need until morning to make my decision," she said finally. "This is too important to rush. I understand completely. But Charlotte, may I call you Charlotte? I want you to know that regardless of what you decide, I'm genuinely grateful for everything you've already done. You saved my life, and I'll never forget that kindness." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "You're planning to leave even if I decide not to help, aren't you?" "I can't stay in Copper Ridge much longer without putting you and everyone else here at risk. Vale's men will eventually track me here, and when they do, innocent people could get hurt. I won't have that on my conscience." Charlotte felt an unexpected pang of regret at the thought of James leaving. In just a few days, he had brought more intellectual stimulation and genuine excitement into her life than she had experienced in years. The prospect of returning to her routine existence treating routine ailments suddenly seemed depressingly mundane. "Where would you go if you left alone?" "South, toward the border. Try to reach at least one cache site on my own, recover enough evidence to prove my innocence. It would be more dangerous without a partner, but I don't have much choice. And if Vale's men catch up with you," James shrugged with an attempt at casual indifference that didn't quite conceal his underlying concern. "Then I suppose my story ends rather abruptly, and Vale gets away with his crimes permanently." The matter-of-fact way he accepted the possibility of death struck Charlotte as both admirable and tragic. Here was a man who had lost everything: his reputation, his fiancée, his position in society, his security, but who remained determined to fight for justice even at the cost of his life. "James," she said impulsively, "assuming I decided to help you, how confident are you that we could actually succeed? Not just in recovering some of the treasure, but in clearing your name and bringing Vale to justice." His expression grew thoughtful as he considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I think our chances of recovering at least some of the treasure are quite good. Vale chose his hiding places well, but his systematic approach makes them predictable once you understand his methods. Clearing my name and stopping Vale would be more challenging, but the evidence exists if we can gather enough of it. And the likelihood that we'd both survive the attempt? Better than even odds if we're careful and lucky. Vale's men are dangerous, but they're not omnipotent. They've been chasing me for a month without success, which suggests they're not quite as skilled as their reputation indicates. Charlotte found his realistic assessment of both the opportunities and risks oddly reassuring. A man who made unrealistic promises or minimized obvious dangers would have been far less trustworthy than one who acknowledged the genuine challenges involved. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "Let me sleep on this decision. I'll give you my answer in the morning." "Fair enough. And Charlotte, whatever you decide, I want you to know that meeting you has restored some of my faith in human decency. In a world where most people are motivated primarily by self-interest, your willingness to help a stranger without expecting anything in return gives me hope that there are still genuinely good people in the world." Charlotte felt herself flush slightly at the unexpected compliment. "I'm not sure I'm as altruistic as you make me sound. The possibility of recovering a fortune in treasure isn't exactly an unappealing prospect." "Perhaps not. But you helped me before you knew anything about treasure or stolen money. You risked your own safety to save the life of a complete stranger, and that says something important about your character." After she had bid James good night and returned to her own room, Charlotte found sleep elusive. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling while her mind raced through the implications of the decision before her. By morning, she would need to choose between the security of her established life and the extraordinary opportunity James was offering. The safe choice was obvious. Send James on his way with her best wishes and return to her predictable but comfortable existence as Copper Ridge's doctor. She had worked hard to build her practice and establish her reputation, and risking everything on what amounted to a treasure-hunting adventure with a fugitive from justice seemed like professional and personal suicide. But the alternative, continuing to treat routine cases in a small frontier town while gradually aging into spinster respectability, suddenly seemed like a different kind of death. Charlotte realized that she had been slowly suffocating in the very security she had worked so hard to achieve. When had she become so cautious? When had the woman who had defied convention by pursuing medical training and establishing an independent practice in the frontier become someone who was afraid to take risks? Charlotte Whitmore, who had arrived in Copper Ridge 5 years earlier, would have jumped at the chance for such an adventure. As dawn light began to filter through her window, Charlotte made her decision. She would help James Blackwood recover his stolen treasure and clear his name. The risks were significant, but the potential rewards, both financial and personal, were worth the gamble. More importantly, she realized she had reached a point in her life where the greatest risk wasn't taking a chance on an uncertain future, but rather accepting the slow stagnation of a predictable present. By the time she heard James stirring in the room next door, Charlotte had already begun mentally preparing for the journey ahead. Charlotte descended the stairs at dawn with her leather medical bag in one hand and a hastily packed travel satchel in the other. Her decision, once made, had crystallized into determined action. Mrs. Henderson stood at the kitchen stove, preparing what appeared to be a larger breakfast than usual, her knowing glance suggesting she had noticed the subtle preparations taking place around her boarding house. "Traveling somewhere, dear?" the older woman asked with studied casualness as she ladled eggs onto a plate. "Tucson," Charlotte replied, employing the cover story she and James had discussed. "There's a medical conference on frontier surgery techniques. I'll be gone in approximately a week." Mrs. Henderson's expression remained neutral, though Charlotte detected a hint of skepticism in her eyes. The landlady had spent decades on the frontier and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from observing human nature in all its varieties. Mighty sudden conference, she observed mildly. Most doctors receive invitations weeks in advance. Last-minute addition to the program, Charlotte explained, hoping her voice carried more conviction than she felt. They need someone with experience, treating gunshot wounds to present a paper on field surgery. It wasn't entirely a lie. Charlotte did possess extensive experience with traumatic injuries, and she could probably deliver such a presentation if required. Mrs. Henderson seemed to accept the explanation, though her knowing look suggested she understood there were aspects of the situation not being discussed openly. James appeared at the foot of the stairs, moving with only slight stiffness from his healing shoulder wound. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair back in a way that made him look more like the respectable businessman he claimed to have been. The transformation was striking. Gone was the desperate fugitive who had collapsed at her door, replaced by a man who could easily pass for a successful merchant or territorial official. "Mr. Connor," Mrs. Henderson greeted him formally. "Feeling well enough to travel, I see." "Much better, thanks to Dr. Whitmore's excellent care," James replied smoothly. "I'll be heading south today to rejoin my surveying expedition." The landlady served them breakfast while making small talk about weather conditions and travel routes, her manner suggesting polite interest rather than suspicion. Charlotte found herself impressed by James's ability to maintain casual conversation while discussing practical matters that reinforced their cover stories. After breakfast, they retrieved James's horse from Murphy's stable. The black stallion named Midnight appeared well-rested and eager for travel, greeting James with obvious affection, while eyeing Charlotte with the cautious interest horses typically showed toward unfamiliar humans. "He's magnificent," Charlotte observed, running her hand along the animal's sleek neck. "Expensive breeding." "Gift from my father when I graduated from university," James explained, his voice carrying a note of sadness. "One of the few possessions Vale couldn't steal through legal manipulation." Charlotte had arranged to rent a sturdy mare from the livery stable, a sensible bay named Sage, who lacked Midnight's elegance, but possessed the kind of steady temperament that made for reliable long-distance travel. Her own riding experience was limited but adequate. Frontier doctors needed to reach patients in remote locations, and horseback travel was often the only practical option. They loaded their supplies with careful attention to balancing necessity against the need to travel light and fast. Charlotte packed her medical instruments, enough laudanum and bandages to treat serious injuries, and a selection of herbs and powders for various ailments. James contributed camping gear, tools for excavation, and a significant arsenal of weapons. That included 2 rifles, a shotgun, and enough ammunition for a small war. "Expecting trouble?" Charlotte asked as she watched him secure the weapons to their pack animals. "Vale's men aren't the only dangerous people in the territory," James replied grimly. "The route we'll be taking passes through areas where Apache raiders and Mexican bandits are active. Better to be over-prepared than caught defenseless." They departed Copper Ridge as the morning sun climbed above the eastern mountains, riding south through terrain that gradually transitioned from high desert scrubland to more arid landscapes dotted with giant saguaro cacti and distinctive red rock formations. Charlotte found herself exhilarated by the sense of adventure and purpose that accompanied their departure, though she remained acutely aware of the risks they were accepting. The first day's travel proceeded without incident, covering nearly 30 miles through increasingly wild country. They encountered occasional freight wagons and groups of travelers heading north toward Tucson, but the traffic thinned considerably as they moved farther from established routes. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered canyon that provided concealment from casual observation while offering multiple escape routes if they encountered hostile forces. James proved surprisingly skilled at frontier camping, efficiently establishing a fire, preparing their meal, and organizing their gear with the competence of someone accustomed to extended periods in the wilderness. "You said you weren't really a geological surveyor," Charlotte observed as she watched him work. "But you certainly know your way around a wilderness camp." Harvard education included more than just business classes, James replied with a slight smile. "I spent summers working for legitimate mining companies, learning the practical aspects of mineral exploration. The experience proved more valuable than most of my formal coursework." As darkness settled over their camp, they sat beside the fire, discussing the details of their expedition. James spread out hand-drawn maps showing the route to their first target location, a cache site he believed contained approximately $30,000 in gold coins. "The location is about 60 miles southeast of here in a canyon system, near the Mexican border," he explained, pointing to marks on the rough map. "Vail chose it because the area is remote enough to discourage casual exploration, but distinctive enough that the hiding place can be relocated reliably." Charlotte studied the terrain features James had sketched, noting the careful attention to landmarks and geographical details. "How certain are you about the exact location?" "Within a few hundred yards, based on descriptions in his private correspondence," James replied. Vail was methodical. He used consistent criteria for selecting cache sites, always near distinctive rock formations, always with access to water, always positioned to be invisible from commonly traveled routes. "And you're confident the treasure is still there? It's been months since you first discovered his operations." James nodded thoughtfully. Vail's correspondence indicates he planned to retrieve the caches only after the investigation into his crimes had been completed and attention had shifted elsewhere. He wouldn't have risked exposing the locations prematurely. Charlotte appreciated his logical reasoning, though she wondered what other factors might have affected Vail's plans. "What if he suspected you had discovered the cache locations? Wouldn't that motivate him to relocate the treasure?" "Possibly, but moving that much gold and silver would require significant resources and trusted personnel. Vail's operation depended on secrecy. The more people involved in relocating caches, the greater the risk of exposure." They talked late into the night, reviewing contingency plans and discussing potential complications they might encounter. Charlotte found herself increasingly impressed by the thoroughness of James's preparation and his realistic assessment of both opportunities and risks. The second day brought their first serious obstacle. They were crossing a stretch of particularly desolate terrain when Sage began favoring her left front hoof, displaying the subtle lameness that indicated a developing problem. Charlotte dismounted to examine the mare's foot, discovering a sharp stone wedged firmly between the hoof and horseshoe. "Can you remove it?" James asked, joining her examination of the injured hoof. Charlotte worked carefully with her medical instruments, managing to extract the stone without causing additional damage. However, the hoof showed signs of bruising and minor infection that would require several days of rest to heal properly. "She can't carry me safely over rough terrain in this condition," Charlotte concluded reluctantly. Forcing her to continue could cause permanent lameness. The setback threatened to derail their entire expedition. They were still 2 days from their destination, traveling through country where replacement horses would be impossible to obtain. James studied their maps while considering alternatives. "There's a small settlement about 20 miles east of here," he said finally. "San Miguel, mostly Mexican families, but they might have horses available for trade or purchase. That would mean a significant detour from our planned route." "True, but it's our best option unless you're willing to ride double on midnight for the rest of the journey." Charlotte considered the alternative. Midnight was strong enough to carry 2 riders, but the additional weight would slow their progress considerably and limit their mobility if they encountered trouble. More importantly, it would leave them with only 1 mount if they needed to make a rapid escape. "Let's try San Miguel," she decided. Better to lose a day now than risk being stranded later. The detour to San Miguel proved more complicated than anticipated. The settlement consisted of perhaps a dozen adobe buildings arranged around a small plaza with a mission church that appeared to be the community's primary focal point. The residents regarded the arrival of two well-armed Anglo-travelers with obvious wariness, though they responded to James's respectful attempts at communication in Spanish. The village possessed only a few horses, most of which were working animals essential to local families' survival. However, the village headman, an elderly rancher named Don Carlos, proved willing to negotiate after James explained their situation and offered generous payment for a suitable replacement mount. "Your horse, she is valuable," Don Carlos observed, in heavily accented English, examining Sage with the expert eye of a lifelong horseman. "Good breeding, well cared for. I give you a young stallion in trade, plus $20 of American money." The offer was more than fair. The stallion in question was a spirited paint horse that appeared healthy and strong. However, Charlotte felt reluctant to abandon Sage, who had served her faithfully for over 2 years. "The mare recover completely, with proper care?" she asked Don Carlos. "Si, senora. Stone bruise, nothing more. 2 weeks of rest, she will be good as new. You return this way, I sell her back for the same price." It was an honorable arrangement that solved their immediate problem while ensuring Sage would receive proper care during her recovery. Charlotte agreed to the trade, though she insisted on leaving additional money to guarantee the mare's medical treatment. The transaction completed, they resumed their journey with Charlotte mounted on the paint stallion she decided to call Cisco. The new horse proved to have a different gait than Sage, requiring some adjustment, but he displayed the kind of endurance and sure-footedness that made for excellent desert travel. Their third day brought a different kind of challenge. They were following a narrow canyon route when James suddenly raised his hand in a signal for silence, his expression alert and wary. Charlotte reined in Cisco, straining to hear whatever had caught James's attention. The sound came again, distant voices speaking in Spanish, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it difficult to determine exact direction or distance. James motioned for Charlotte to follow him as he guided Midnight toward a cluster of large boulders that offered concealment from the main trail. "Bandits?" Charlotte whispered as they took cover. "Possibly. The border country is full of men who make their living robbing travelers," James replied quietly, checking his rifle. "Could also be smugglers or Apache raiders. Better to avoid contact regardless." They waited in tense silence as the voices grew closer, eventually resolving into a conversation between at least 4 men discussing routes and timing in rapid Spanish. Charlotte's limited knowledge of the language allowed her to catch occasional words: oro, meaning gold, gringo, referring to Americans, and norte, indicating northern direction. The group passed their hiding place without detecting their presence, but James insisted they remain concealed for another hour to ensure the riders had moved well beyond the area. Only when complete silence had returned to the canyon did he indicate it was safe to resume travel. "What do you think they were?" Charlotte asked as they returned to the trail. "Hard to say for certain, but the fact that they were discussing gold and Americans suggests they might be connected to Vale's operation," James replied grimly. "Vale has been known to hire Mexican gunmen when he needs work done south of the border. The possibility that they were being actively hunted added new urgency to their mission. If Vale had indeed hired local criminals to watch for James's appearance in the border region, their margin for error had become even smaller. That evening they camped without a fire, eating cold food and speaking in whispers, while James maintained regular watches throughout the night. Charlotte found sleep difficult, her medical training making her acutely aware of how vulnerable they were to attack in the vast wilderness surrounding them. Dawn brought clearer skies, but also troubling signs on their back trail. James, using A small telescope to scan the terrain behind them spotted dust clouds that suggested other riders were following their general route. "Could be coincidence," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Lots of people travel through this country, but you don't think it is a coincidence?" "No, the timing and direction are too consistent with our movements. I think we're being tracked." Charlotte felt a chill of fear at the confirmation of her growing suspicions. "How far behind are they?" "Several hours, maybe more. Hard to judge distance accurately in this terrain. Can we outrun them?" James considered the question while studying his maps. "Possibly, if we're willing to take risks. There's a more direct route to our destination that passes through Apache territory. Most people avoid it, but our pursuers might not expect us to choose such a dangerous path." "What kind of risks are we talking about?" "Apache war parties are active in that region. They've been raiding settlements and attacking travelers since spring, but they're also the reason other people avoid the area. It might be the safest route precisely because it's so dangerous." Charlotte appreciated the ironic logic. How much time would the shorter route save? Half a day, maybe more. And it would take us through terrain where mounted pursuit would be more difficult. The decision represented another escalation in the risks they were accepting. Apache raiders were notorious for their skill in desert warfare and their brutal treatment of captives. But the alternative, continuing on their current route while being hunted by Vale's gunmen, might prove equally dangerous. "Your call," Charlotte said, recognizing that James possessed more experience with the tactical aspects of their situation. "Apache route," he decided. "At least we know what we're dealing with. Vale's men are an unknown quantity." They altered course immediately, heading east through increasingly rugged terrain that tested both their riding skills and their horses' endurance. The landscape became more dramatically beautiful, but also more forbidding. Towering rock spires, deep arroyos, and vast expanses of desert that seemed to stretch endlessly toward distant mountains. By midday, they had entered a country that showed clear signs of Apache presence. Ancient petroglyphs, decorated rock walls, and carefully constructed stone markers indicated traditional boundaries and sacred sites. James insisted they avoid disturbing any of these markers, explaining that such disrespect could provoke violent retaliation from Apache scouts who monitored the region. Their caution proved justified when they discovered fresh horse tracks near a water source, unshod ponies traveling in a group that suggested a war party rather than peaceful hunters. The tracks were no more than a day old, indicating active Apache presence in their immediate area. "We need to be extremely careful," James warned as they refilled their water containers. "Apache scouts are among the finest trackers in the world. If they decide we're a threat, we'll have very little warning before they attack." Charlotte found herself wondering if they had made the right choice in entering Apache territory. The pursuing gunmen represented a known threat with predictable motivations, while Apache raiders were an unpredictable force guided by cultural and political considerations she didn't understand. But as the day progressed without incident, she began to appreciate the strategic wisdom of James's decision. The difficult terrain was slowing their progress, but would be equally challenging for mounted pursuit. More importantly, their pursuers would be forced to choose between following them into dangerous Apache country or abandoning the chase entirely. As evening approached, they reached a high ridge that offered expansive views of the territory behind them. James used his telescope to scan for signs of pursuit while Charlotte prepared a cold meal from their dwindling supplies. "I don't see any dust clouds," James reported after a thorough examination of their back trail. "Either they've given up, or they're being more careful about concealing their approach. Which do you think is more likely?" "Probably the latter. Vale's men are professionals. They wouldn't be deterred by difficult terrain or potential Apache presence." Charlotte absorbed this assessment while contemplating their situation. They were now deep in hostile territory, being hunted by dangerous men. with their destination still a full day's travel ahead. The romantic notion of treasure hunting was giving way to the harsh reality of survival in one of America's most unforgiving landscapes. "James," she said quietly, "are you certain this cache site actually exists? Because if we're risking our lives for information that proves to be inaccurate—" "I understand your concern," he replied seriously, "but yes, I'm confident the cache exists. Vale's correspondence was too detailed and consistent to be fictional. He invested too much effort in establishing these hiding places to have created false records. And you're equally confident we can find it based on the information you have?" "Reasonably confident. Vale's descriptions are thorough, and the geographical features he mentions should be distinctive enough to locate reliably." Charlotte nodded, accepting his assessment, while privately hoping their faith in his research would prove justified. Tomorrow would bring them to the first test of the information that had cost James his reputation and nearly his life as stars. Emerged in the clear desert sky, they prepared for another night of cautious camping in hostile territory. Charlotte found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few days. She had gone from treating routine medical cases in a safe frontier town to participating in a treasure hunt through Apache country while being pursued by hired killers. The transformation should have been terrifying, but instead, Charlotte discovered she felt more alive and purposeful than she had in years. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she was no longer merely existing in comfortable predictability. She was actively pursuing a future that promised extraordinary rewards along with extraordinary risks. The canyon revealed itself gradually as they descended from the high ridge, its red sandstone walls rising like ancient cathedrals around a narrow valley, floor dotted with mesquite and palo verde trees. Charlotte consulted James's hand-drawn map while scanning the terrain for the distinctive landmarks Vale had described in his correspondence. "The rock formation should be directly ahead," James said, pointing toward a cluster of weathered spires that resembled giant fingers reaching skyward. Vale called it Los Dedos del Diablo, the Devil's Fingers. Charlotte studied the formation through James's telescope, noting the unique erosion patterns that made it unmistakable. Even from a distance, she could see why Vale had chosen this location. The spires were visible from miles away, yet the canyon itself remained hidden from casual observation. They approached cautiously, James dismounting to examine the ground for signs of recent activity. The desert floor held tracks well, and any evidence of other visitors would be preserved in the hard-packed earth for weeks or months. "Clean," he reported after a thorough inspection. "No horse tracks, no boot prints, no indication anyone's been here recently." Charlotte felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension as they entered the shadow of the towering rock spires. Somewhere within a few hundred yards of their current position lay treasure worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, if James's research proved accurate. According to Vale's notes, the cache was buried beneath a distinctive boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, located precisely 100 paces northeast of the tallest spire. James counted his steps carefully, while Charlotte kept watch for any signs of danger, her rifle ready across her saddle. "There," James said, stopping beside a massive boulder whose rounded contours did indeed resemble a resting animal. "This has to be it." Charlotte dismounted and joined him in examining the site. The ground around the boulder showed no obvious signs of disturbance, but Vale would have been careful to conceal evidence of his excavation work. James began probing the earth with a steel rod, searching for the telltale resistance that would indicate a buried container. After 20 minutes of methodical searching, the rod struck something solid approximately 3 feet below the surface. "Metal," James said, his voice tight with anticipation. "Feels like a strongbox or chest." They worked together to excavate the cache, taking turns with shovel and pickaxe while the other maintained surveillance. The desert heat made the physical labor exhausting, but adrenaline sustained them through the grueling work. 2 hours later, they had exposed the top of an iron strongbox, its surface green with patina but structurally intact. James used a crowbar to break the heavy padlock, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to lift the lid. Inside, nested in oiled cloth, lay neat stacks of gold and silver coins, along with bundled currency and several leather document pouches. Even in the shadowed excavation, the precious metals gleamed with unmistakable authenticity. "Dear God," Charlotte whispered, staring at wealth beyond anything she had previously imagined. "It's real." James lifted one of the gold coin stacks, examining the mint marks and dates. Double eagles, mostly from the San Francisco Mint. Each coin is worth $20. He made rapid calculations. This cash alone contains approximately $35,000. Charlotte picked up one of the document pouches, finding it filled with stock certificates, property deeds, and legal papers bearing Harrison Vale's signature. These could prove his guilt in multiple fraud cases. "Exactly what we hoped to find," James agreed, his expression mixing triumph with renewed determination. "This is just the beginning. The other cache sites should contain even more valuable evidence." They worked quickly to inventory the contents, documenting everything before repacking the most portable valuables into their saddlebags. The gold coins alone weighed over 40 pounds, requiring careful distribution between their pack animals to avoid overloading either horse. As they prepared to depart, Charlotte noticed movement on the canyon rim above them. Sunlight reflected off metal, possibly a telescope or rifle scope, before disappearing behind the rocks. "James," she said urgently, pointing toward the rim. "Someone's watching us." He followed her gaze, immediately grasping the implications. Vale's men. They must have followed us through Apache country after all. The strategic situation had suddenly become desperate. They were trapped in a narrow canyon with limited escape routes, while their pursuers held the high ground and could observe their every movement. "How many do you think?" Charlotte asked, checking her weapons. "At least 3, probably more. Professional manhunters don't operate with small crews." James studied the canyon walls, evaluating their options. "We need to move immediately, before they can surround us completely." They mounted quickly and spurred their horses toward the canyon's eastern mouth, the only route that offered potential escape. Behind them, rifle shots echoed off the stone walls as their pursuers opened fire from concealed positions. The race through the canyon became a nightmare of thundering hooves, ricocheting bullets, and desperate maneuvering around natural obstacles. Charlotte flattened herself against Cisco's neck, trusting the paint horse's sure footing on the treacherous terrain, while James returned fire with his rifle. A bullet struck the rock inches from Charlotte's head, showering her with stone fragments. She realized their pursuers were shooting to wound rather than kill. They wanted the treasure and the incriminating documents, which meant keeping their quarry alive for interrogation. They burst from the canyon mouth into open desert, gaining precious moments while their pursuers descended from the rim positions. James led them southeast toward a series of low hills that might offer concealment, pushing their horses to dangerous speeds across ground riddled with prairie dog holes and hidden arroyos. "There!" James shouted, pointing toward a cluster of adobe ruins that marked an abandoned settlement. "We can make a stand there." The ruins provided better defensive positions than open ground, but Charlotte realized they were only postponing the inevitable. Their pursuers had superior numbers and could afford to wait while ammunition and water ran low. As they took cover behind crumbling walls, James made rapid calculations about their situation. "We can't outrun them with this much gold weighing us down." "Are you suggesting we abandon the treasure?" Charlotte asked, appalled at the thought of sacrificing their hard-won prize. "Not abandon, hide it. There's no point in recovering Vale's cash if we're killed before we can use the evidence to clear my name." The logic was unassailable. though Charlotte felt bitter disappointment at the prospect of burying their newly discovered wealth. They selected the most incriminating documents and a representative sample of the gold coins, concealing the remainder beneath the ruins' stone floor. "If we survive this, we can return for the rest," James said, marking the location carefully on his map. Their pursuers appeared as distant dust clouds, approaching with the patience of professionals who understood they held tactical advantage. Charlotte counted at least 5 riders, all well armed and moving with military precision. "Do we know who they are?" she asked, studying the approaching force through the telescope. James focused on the lead rider, a tall man in a black coat whose bearing suggested leadership authority. "That's Marcus Kane, Vale's chief enforcer, former army sergeant dishonorably discharged for excessive violence against civilians." "And the others?" "Gunmen from Texas and New Mexico. Kane recruits men with reputations for ruthlessness and discretion." Charlotte absorbed this information while checking her medical supplies. If the coming confrontation resulted in wounds, she would need to treat injuries under combat conditions, assuming any of them survived the encounter. Kane's voice carried clearly across the desert as his force deployed around the ruins. "Blackwood, I know you're in there. Let's discuss this situation like reasonable men." James positioned himself behind a section of wall that offered both protection and clear fields of fire. "What do you want, Kane?" "The same thing you want, to resolve this mess without unnecessary bloodshed. Mr. Vale is prepared to be reasonable about your misunderstanding regarding certain business transactions." "You mean the crimes he committed using my name and reputation?" Kane's laugh held no humor. "That's all ancient history now. What matters is returning certain property that doesn't belong to you, along with some papers that have caused considerable confusion." Charlotte understood the negotiation's underlying reality. Kane wanted the treasure and documents, but preferred to obtain them without violence that might complicate Vale's legal situation. Dead bodies created investigations, witnesses, and unwanted attention from territorial authorities. "And if I cooperate?" James called back. "Clean slate, new identity, passage to California or Mexico, enough money to start fresh somewhere Vale's influence doesn't reach." It was a generous offer from a criminal perspective, though Charlotte doubted Kane had any intention of honoring such an agreement. Men like Vale eliminated loose ends rather than creating potential future problems. James seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Not interested in your employer's promises. I've seen how he honors his agreements." "Then we have a problem," Kane replied, his tone hardening, "because I'm not leaving without what I came for." The siege that followed tested Charlotte's courage, more severely than any medical emergency she had previously faced. Kane's men took positions surrounding the ruins, maintaining constant pressure through sniper fire and periodic assaults that probed for weaknesses in their defensive positions. Water became critically scarce as the day progressed, forcing them to ration their remaining supplies while the desert heat intensified their suffering. Charlotte used her medical knowledge to treat minor wounds and manage their physical condition, but she recognized they couldn't sustain prolonged resistance. As evening approached, Kane tried a different approach. "Dr. Whitmore." "Yes, we know. Who you are? Former physician from back east, respectable woman who got mixed up with the wrong man." Charlotte felt exposed and vulnerable, hearing her identity spoken by their enemy. Kane had obviously conducted thorough research into James's associates and circumstances. "You don't have to die for Blackwood's crimes," Kane continued. "Walk out now with your medical bag, and you can return to your practice in Copper Ridge. No questions asked, no consequences for this unfortunate adventure." The offer was tempting. Escape with her life and reputation intact, while James faced the consequences of his conflict with Vale alone. But Charlotte realized she had passed the point where such retreats were possible. She had committed herself to this partnership and its dangers. "Dr. Whitmore has made her choice," James called back. "We stand together!" Kane's response was immediate and violent, a concentrated assault that drove them deeper into the ruins while bullets chipped stone, fragments from their protective walls. Charlotte found herself returning fire with the cold precision her frontier experience had taught her, targeting exposed positions with her rifle while James coordinated their defensive efforts. During a lull in the fighting, James made a desperate suggestion. "There's an old mine shaft behind these ruins. Probably connects to underground passages. If we can reach it without being seen, and if it's a dead end, then we die underground instead of in the open. But it's our only chance." They gathered their essential supplies and prepared for a final, desperate gambit. The abandoned mine represented unknown dangers: cave-ins, toxic gases, underground water, or simply passages that led nowhere. But the alternative was certain death at the hands of Kane's professional killers. As darkness fell completely over the desert, they prepared to abandon their defensive positions for the uncertain safety of the underground tunnels that might offer salvation or merely a different form of tomb. The entrance to the abandoned mine shaft gaped like a mouth in the desert floor. Its wooden support timbers rotted and partially collapsed after decades of neglect. Charlotte stared into the absolute darkness beyond, her medical training warring with basic survival instinct as she contemplated descending into unknown dangers. "The air smells wrong," she observed, detecting the musty odor of stagnant water and decaying organic matter. There could be toxic gases, unstable structures, or underground flooding. James tested the wooden ladder leading down into the shaft, wincing as several rungs crumbled under minimal pressure. "Kane's men will be watching this entrance by morning. If we don't go down, we're trapped here until they decide to finish us." Charlotte understood the logic, even as she dreaded the descent. Above ground, they faced certain death from professional killers who held every tactical advantage. Below ground, they confronted unknown hazards that might prove equally fatal, but at least offered the possibility of escape. "How deep do you think it goes?" she asked, peering into the blackness with her oil lamp. Mining records from the territorial office suggest these shafts reach depths of 60 to 80 feet, with horizontal passages connecting to other workings in the area. James shouldered his pack, checking that their precious documents remained secure. Some of the tunnels might connect to natural cave systems that extend for miles underground. They began their descent carefully, testing each rung of the deteriorated ladder, while Kane's voice echoed from the ruins above, issuing orders to his men about maintaining perimeter security through the night. Charlotte counted steps as they descended, noting the gradual change in air temperature and humidity. At 30 feet, the ladder ended at a narrow ledge carved from solid rock. James's lamp revealed a horizontal passage extending eastward into the mountain, its walls reinforced with timber supports that appeared more stable than the entrance structure. "This way," James whispered, though the precaution seemed unnecessary in their underground isolation. His voice carried strangely in the confined space, echoing with hollow distortion. They moved single file through the narrow tunnel, Charlotte following close behind while maintaining contact with the rough-hewn wall to avoid becoming disoriented. The passage descended gradually, occasionally branching into side tunnels that disappeared into impenetrable darkness. 20 minutes into their underground journey, they encountered their first major obstacle. A section of tunnel had partially collapsed, leaving an opening barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The timber supports groaned ominously as they approached, suggesting the entire structure remained dangerously unstable. "Can we get through?" Charlotte asked, studying the restricted passage with growing apprehension. James removed his pack and pushed it ahead of him as he began wriggling through the narrow gap. "It's tight, but passable. Just be careful not to put pressure on those support beams." Charlotte followed his example, forcing herself through the constricted opening while loose rocks showered down around her. Her medical bag caught on a protruding timber, requiring precious minutes to work it free without triggering further collapse. Beyond the obstruction, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber that had clearly served as a junction point for multiple mining operations. 3 additional passages branched off in different directions, their entrances marked with faded signs indicating depth measurements and ore quality assessments. "Which way?" Charlotte asked, studying the options by lamplight. James consulted. His rough map, correlating their current position with the territorial survey records he had memorized. The southern passage should connect to the main drainage system. If it's still clear, it could take us several miles from Kane's position. They chose the southern route, following a tunnel that showed evidence of more recent activity. Fresh tool marks scarred the walls, and wooden rail tracks still held remnants of ore carts that had transported materials to the surface decades earlier. The discovery of human remains in a side alcove brought them to an abrupt halt. A skeleton, in rotted clothing, lay crumpled against the wall, its skull crushed by falling rocks. Charlotte knelt to examine the scene, her medical training automatically assessing cause of death. "Mining accident," she concluded, after studying the victim's injuries. "Probably happened during the original excavation work. The skull fractures are consistent with being struck by heavy debris." James nodded grimly. "These old mines are full of such discoveries. Men died regularly in mining operations, and remote accidents often went unreported. The grim reminder of underground dangers made their continued journey feel increasingly perilous. Every creaking timber and shower of loose stone emphasized how easily they could join the anonymous victims claimed by these abandoned workings. Water began appearing in pools along the tunnel floor, forcing them to navigate carefully around flooded sections, while their lamp flames reflected eerily in the dark surface. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the mineral taste of deep earth and stagnant moisture. "The tunnel's flooding," Charlotte observed, noting how the water level seemed to be rising gradually as they progressed. "Seasonal runoff from winter snows," James explained, though his tone carried new concern. "If the drainage system is blocked, these lower passages could fill completely." The implication was terrifying. They could find themselves trapped underwater in a subterranean maze with no possibility of escape. Charlotte fought down panic while forcing herself to continue moving forward through the increasingly treacherous conditions. Their progress slowed as the water deepened, eventually reaching waist height in some sections. Charlotte held her medical bag above her head while struggling through the freezing flood, her lamp casting wavering shadows on walls that seemed to close in around them. When they finally emerged from the flooded section onto higher ground, both were exhausted and shivering from prolonged exposure to the cold water. James established a brief rest stop in a dry chamber, allowing them to assess their condition and remaining supplies. "We've been underground for over 3 hours, he reported after consulting his pocket watch. "Kane's men have probably realized we escaped through the mine entrance by now. Can they follow us?" Charlotte asked, wringing water from her skirts while trying to preserve their remaining lamp oil. "Unlikely. Professional gunmen aren't usually equipped for underground exploration, and Kane would be reluctant to risk his men in unstable tunnels." The assessment provided some comfort, though Charlotte realized their escape from immediate pursuit had merely exchanged one set of dangers for another. They were now lost in an underground labyrinth with limited supplies, uncertain directions, and unknown hazards waiting in every dark passage. A new sound began echoing through the tunnels, a distant rumbling that seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth itself. James listened intently, his expression growing more concerned as the noise continued. "What is that?" Charlotte whispered, though she suspected the answer would be unwelcome. "Blasting," James replied grimly. "Someone's using dynamite in the mine system." Charlotte felt her heart sink as she grasped the implications. Kane's men. They're trying to collapse the tunnels behind us, cutting off our retreat while forcing us toward whatever exit they've identified ahead. The rumbling intensified, accompanied by the crash of falling timber and the grinding of shifting stone. Dust clouds began drifting through the passage, carrying the acrid scent of explosive chemicals and pulverized rock. "We need to move faster," James said, gathering their gear with desperate efficiency. "If they're systematically collapsing sections, we could be buried alive." They resumed their underground flight with new urgency, pushing through fatigue and growing fear while the sounds of destruction followed them through the maze of tunnels. Each explosion seemed closer than the last, accompanied by tremors that loosened rocks and threatened to bring down the remaining support structures. The passage began ascending again, offering hope that they were approaching another exit to the surface. Fresh air began mixing with the stagnant underground atmosphere, carrying the sweet scent of desert vegetation and the promise of escape from their subterranean prison. When they finally emerged from a concealed cave entrance among a cluster of boulders, dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. They had traveled underground for nearly 6 hours, covering an estimated 4 miles through the abandoned mine system, while Kane's demolition work sealed their route behind them. "Where are we?" Charlotte asked, studying the unfamiliar landscape, while her eyes adjusted to daylight after hours of lamp-illuminated darkness. James consulted his compass and surveyed the surrounding terrain. "About 5 miles southeast of the ruins, where we made our stand. Kane's position should be well behind us now." Charlotte felt overwhelming relief at their escape, though she recognized they remained in desperate circumstances. Their horses were lost, their water supplies nearly exhausted, and their location was in the middle of hostile desert country with limited options for reaching civilization. More critically, they had been forced to abandon most of the treasure they had worked so hard to recover. The gold and documents they carried represented only a fraction of the total cash, while the remainder lay hidden beneath the ruins, now occupied by Kane's forces. "The treasure we left behind," she said, voicing her primary concern. "Can we ever recover it?" James studied the distant smoke rising from the demolished mine workings. "Not while Kane controls that area. He'll establish permanent surveillance, waiting for us to return. Then we've lost everything?" "Not everything," James replied, patting the document pouch they had managed to preserve. "We still have enough evidence to prove Vale's guilt and clear my name, and there are other cache sites, locations Kane doesn't know about." Charlotte considered this assessment while calculating their immediate survival needs. They were alive and free, which had seemed impossible just hours earlier. But they were also stranded in a dangerous country with minimal supplies and powerful enemies still pursuing them. "The nearest town?" she asked, focusing on practical necessities. "Presidio, about 20 miles south across the border. Mexican authorities have no jurisdiction over territorial warrants, and the town has resources we need. 20 miles on foot through desert terrain would test their endurance severely, but it represented their best hope for reaching safety and planning their next moves." Charlotte gathered her medical supplies and prepared for another difficult journey, this one under the merciless desert sun. As they began walking south toward the distant border, James made a declaration that surprised her with its quiet determination. "We're not giving up, Charlotte. This setback doesn't end our mission. It just changes our approach." "What do you mean?" she asked, though part of her already suspected his answer. "Vale has 6 more cache sites scattered across the southwest. Kane can't guard them all, and he doesn't have the documentation needed to locate them." James's expression hardened with renewed resolve. "We're going to recover every dollar he stole, gather enough evidence to destroy him completely, and make ourselves rich in the process." Charlotte felt a complex mixture of excitement and trepidation at his words. They had just barely escaped death in their first attempt at treasure recovery, yet James was already planning to continue their dangerous quest. But as she walked beside him through the beautiful, deadly landscape of the Sonoran Desert, Charlotte realized she had passed a point of no return in more ways than one. She was no longer the cautious frontier doctor who had once treated routine ailments in peaceful Copper Ridge. She had become a treasure hunter, a fugitive, a woman willing to risk everything for the chance at extraordinary rewards. Whatever lay ahead, there was no going back to her former life. The choices made in underground darkness had irrevocably committed her to a future defined by danger, adventure, and the pursuit of Harrison Vale's hidden fortune. The cantina in Presidio offered blessed relief from the desert heat. Its thick, adobe walls maintaining cool shadows while ceiling fans stirred the humid air. Charlotte sat at a corner table, her travel-stained clothes marking her as another dusty border crosser seeking temporary refuge in the lawless frontier town. 3 days had passed since their escape from the collapsed mine, 3 days of careful recovery while James made discreet inquiries about transportation and supplies. The Mexican authorities showed little interest in American fugitives as long as they caused no local trouble and spent their money freely. The telegraph office received interesting news this morning, James said, joining Charlotte with 2 glasses of tequila and a folded newspaper. Harrison Vale was arrested in Denver yesterday on federal charges of mail fraud and interstate transportation of stolen property. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken as she scanned the newspaper article. The story described a dramatic dawn raid on Vale's mansion, led by federal marshals acting on evidence provided by an anonymous source. Multiple trunks of incriminating documents had been discovered, along with correspondence detailing fraudulent mining investments across 4 territories. Anonymous source, she asked, meeting James's eyes. I sent copies of Vale's correspondence to the federal prosecutor in Denver before we left for the treasure site, he explained quietly. Insurance policy in case we didn't survive Kane's pursuit. Charlotte marveled at his foresight. While they had been fighting for their lives in underground tunnels, James's careful preparation had been destroying their enemy through legal channels. Will this clear your name? The charges against me have been suspended pending review of new evidence, James confirmed, pointing to a smaller article on the newspaper's back page. The prosecutor believes I was framed, though complete exoneration will require recovering more of the stolen funds. The transformation in their situation felt almost surreal. 3 days earlier, they had been hunted fugitives fleeing professional killers through hostile desert. Now James was potentially vindicated while their primary enemy faced federal prosecution. What about Kane and his men? Charlotte asked. Still dangerous, but their employer can no longer pay them. Vale's assets have been frozen by court order, leaving Kane without financial backing for extended operations. James spread a detailed map across their table, marking locations throughout Arizona and New Mexico with small crosses. Which brings us to our next decision. Vale's remaining cache sites are scattered across 800 miles of territory. We could spend months tracking them down individually. Charlotte studied the marked positions, noting their distribution across some of the Southwest's most remote and dangerous regions. Or we could choose the most valuable targets and ignore the smaller sites. Exactly what I was thinking. These 3 locations, he indicated sites near Tucson, Santa Fe, and El Paso, represent Vale's largest individual caches based on the patterns in his correspondence. Together, they should contain over $200,000 in gold and currency. The sum was staggering, enough wealth to establish them both as genuinely rich by any reasonable standard. Charlotte found herself contemplating possibilities that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Establishing the finest medical practice in San Francisco, funding research into new treatments, living in genuine luxury rather than frontier. Necessity, the risks, she asked, forcing herself to consider practical realities alongside financial dreams. Significant, but manageable, James replied honestly. Kane's organization is probably dissolving without Vale's money to hold it together, but other treasure hunters may have learned about the cache sites. We'd be competing against prospectors, claim jumpers, and potentially hostile Apache bands. In some areas, Charlotte absorbed this assessment while watching the cantina's other customers, a mixture of Mexican ranchers, American drifters, and individuals whose occupations were deliberately unclear. All carried weapons openly and minded their own business with the studied indifference of people accustomed to violence. "I have a confession," she said suddenly. "When I decided to help you recover that first cache, I thought we'd find the treasure, clear your name, and return to something resembling normal lives. And now I realize I don't want a normal life anymore. The past few weeks have been the most frightening, exhausting, and exhilarating experience of my existence. The thought of returning to treating routine ailments in some quiet town sounds like a form of death." James smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she had seen from him since their partnership began. "So you're proposing we continue treasure hunting as a permanent profession?" "I'm proposing we recover every dollar Vale stole, establish ourselves as wealthy enough to live however we choose, and then decide what kind of life we want to build together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither had previously addressed directly. Their partnership had evolved from medical necessity through criminal conspiracy to something approaching genuine affection, but the romantic dimension remained largely unspoken. "Together," James repeated thoughtfully. "Are you suggesting a permanent partnership extends beyond business arrangements?" Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, but met his gaze directly. "I'm suggesting that whatever we've become to each other, it's more than just convenient cooperation between temporary allies." James reached across the table to take her hand, his fingers warm against her palm. "Charlotte, I need you to understand something important. When this began, I thought of you as an exceptionally capable woman who might help me achieve specific goals. But somewhere in those underground tunnels, I realized you've become the most important person in my world." The simple declaration affected Charlotte more profoundly than elaborate romantic speeches might have. Here was a man who had lost everything: reputation, fortune, social position, yet was willing to build a new life based on partnership with a woman society would consider scandalous for her unconventional choices. "Then we agreed," she said simply. "We recover the remaining treasure, establish our financial independence, and see what kind of future we can create together." Their planning session continued late into the evening, developing strategies for approaching the 3 major cache sites while minimizing exposure to remaining dangers. James's research had provided detailed intelligence about each location, including geographical challenges, local authorities, and potential complications. The Tucson site appeared most accessible, located near established transportation routes, with reliable water sources and moderate security risks. The Santa Fe cache presented greater challenges due to territorial government presence and active mining operations in the area. The El Paso location offered the largest potential reward, but also the greatest dangers, positioned near Apache strongholds and Mexican bandit territory. Tucson first, Charlotte decided after reviewing all factors. Establish our success pattern with a manageable challenge before attempting the more difficult sites. Over the following days, they acquired proper equipment and transportation for their continued treasure hunting. James purchased a sturdy wagon and team of mules, while Charlotte restocked her medical supplies and obtained additional clothing suitable for extended desert travel. The transformation in James's appearance was remarkable as legal vindication restored his confidence and bearing. Gone was the desperate fugitive who had collapsed at her clinic door, replaced by a man who moved with authority and purpose despite their unconventional circumstances. Their departure from Presidio attracted little attention. Another pair of American entrepreneurs heading north with mining equipment and prospecting supplies. The border country was full of such individuals seeking fortune through various legal and quasi-legal enterprises. The journey to Tucson required 8 days of careful travel through terrain that alternated between spectacular beauty and harsh desolation. Charlotte found herself increasingly comfortable with outdoor living, her medical training proving valuable for managing the practical challenges of frontier survival. When they reached the distinctive mesa that marked their destination, Charlotte felt familiar excitement mixed with hard-won caution. Their previous treasure recovery had succeeded, but nearly cost their lives, teaching valuable lessons about preparation and contingency planning. The cache site was located in a narrow canyon, accessible only through a concealed entrance between towering rock walls. According to Vale's notes, the hiding place was marked by a distinctive petroglyph depicting a thunderbird with outstretched wings. They found the ancient symbol exactly where expected, carved into a south-facing rock wall that caught morning sunlight. The cache itself lay buried beneath a flat stone marked with subtle scratches that would be invisible to casual observers, but distinctive to someone knowing what to seek. This excavation proceeded without interruption, revealing another iron strongbox containing gold coins, currency bundles, and legal documents. The treasure exceeded their expectations, nearly $60,000 in precious metals, along with evidence of additional fraud schemes Vale had operated throughout the Southwest. "We're genuinely wealthy now," Charlotte said, staring at the recovered treasure spread across their blanket. The gold alone represented more money than most people earned in decades of hard work. "Wealthy enough to live comfortably anywhere we choose," James agreed, though his expression remained focused on their remaining objectives. "But not wealthy enough to ignore the other sites. The Santa Fe and El Paso caches together contain more than we've recovered so far." Charlotte understood his logic while feeling increasingly aware of how their success was changing them both. The desperate fugitives who had fled through underground tunnels were becoming confident treasure hunters with resources and experience that few people possessed. Their return journey to civilization marked the end of one phase of their partnership and the beginning of something new. Charlotte Whitmore, respectable frontier doctor, had died somewhere in the collapsed mine tunnels. The woman who emerged was Charlotte Blackwood. She had adopted James's surname without ceremony or legal formality, wealthy treasure hunter and partner to a man whose reputation was being restored through federal vindication. As they approached Tucson with their concealed fortune, Charlotte reflected on the extraordinary transformation a single act of medical compassion had generated. Nursing a wounded stranger back to health had ultimately made her one of the richest women in America, but more importantly, it had given her a life of purpose, adventure, and genuine partnership with a man who respected her capabilities and shared her willingness to take extraordinary risks for extraordinary rewards. The future spread before them like the vast desert landscape, beautiful and challenging, full of hidden dangers and unexpected treasures, but infinitely preferable to the safe, predictable existence she had left behind in Copper Ridge. The mansion overlooking San Francisco Bay stood as a testament to what determined individuals could achieve when they refused to accept the limitations others imposed upon them. Charlotte Blackwood stood on the marble terrace, watching cargo ships navigate the harbor while morning fog lifted from the water like ghostly curtains revealing a stage. 5 years had passed since she had nursed a wounded stranger back to health. In a frontier clinic, 5 years that had transformed her from a struggling territorial doctor into one of the wealthiest women in America. The final treasure recoveries in Santa Fe and El Paso had yielded even greater rewards than anticipated, establishing their combined fortune at over $400,000, wealth that placed them among the nation's financial elite. "The final tally arrived from our Denver attorneys," James announced, joining her on the terrace with a leather portfolio containing the morning's correspondence. Harrison Vale was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His assets have been liquidated to compensate defrauded investors, but our evidence helped recover less than half of what he stole. Charlotte accepted the news with satisfaction rather than celebration. Vale's imprisonment represented justice delayed rather than justice denied, though she recognized that many of his victims would never recover their losses completely. "And Marcus Kane?" she asked, remembering their former pursuer, shot dead in a saloon fight in El Paso 3 months ago. Apparently, someone else took exception to his professional methods. James's tone carried no regret for their enemy's violent endeavors. The information closed another chapter in their extraordinary story, eliminating the last significant threat from their treasure-hunting days. Charlotte found herself reflecting on how completely their lives had diverged from conventional expectations for people of their backgrounds and era. Their mansion served as more than mere display of wealth. It had become headquarters for an expanding network of business interests that leveraged their resources into even greater prosperity. James had established a legitimate mining consultation firm that provided geological expertise to investors throughout the West, while Charlotte had founded the Pacific Medical Research Institute, dedicating substantial funds to developing new treatments for frontier diseases. Dr. Morrison's telegram confirms the yellow fever research is showing promising results, Charlotte said, reviewing their institute's latest reports. The new treatment protocol has reduced mortality rates by nearly 30% in controlled trials. "Your father would be proud," James observed. "He raised a daughter who uses her medical knowledge to save lives on a scale he never imagined possible." Charlotte smiled at the thought, though she suspected her father would have been bewildered by the unconventional path that had led to such achievements. The respectable frontier doctor he had trained could never have anticipated becoming a wealthy philanthropist who funded medical research through treasure recovered from criminal enterprises. Their success had attracted attention from sources both welcome and problematic. Territorial governors sought their investment in development projects, while newspaper reporters speculated endlessly about the mysterious couple who had appeared seemingly from nowhere with vast wealth and intriguing backgrounds. "The Chronicle wants to interview us again about our mining investments," James said, indicating another letter in his portfolio. "They're particularly curious about how we identified such profitable opportunities in regions other prospectors had overlooked." "Same response as always," Charlotte replied. "Private investors prefer to protect their methods and sources." The cover story they had developed explained their wealth through shrewd speculation in mining properties, a plausible narrative that satisfied casual curiosity without inviting deeper investigation. Only their closest associates knew the true origins of their fortune, and those individuals had compelling reasons to maintain discretion. Charlotte moved to the ornate desk, where she conducted correspondence with medical professionals throughout the country. Her reputation in scientific circles had grown substantially as her research funding enabled breakthrough discoveries in treating diseases that plagued frontier communities. "Dr. Patterson in Chicago wants us to sponsor a new hospital specializing in traumatic injuries," she said, reviewing his detailed proposal. "He believes our funding could establish the most advanced trauma center west of Philadelphia. Cost estimate, $80,000 for construction and equipment, plus ongoing operational support for the first 5 years." James whistled softly at the figure. Even with their substantial wealth, such expenditures required careful consideration. "What's your assessment of the proposal's merit?" Charlotte had spent considerable time evaluating Patterson's plan, consulting with other medical professionals, and reviewing his previous work. Legitimate opportunity to save hundreds of lives annually. Patterson has the expertise and reputation to make it succeed. "Then we fund it," James decided without hesitation. "Our money should accomplish something more meaningful than merely accumulating in bank accounts." This attitude had guided their philanthropic efforts since establishing their fortune. Rather than simply living in luxury, they had committed substantial resources to causes that addressed genuine human needs while advancing scientific knowledge. Charlotte's Medical Institute had already sponsored research into cholera treatment, surgical techniques for gunshot wounds, and preventive care for mining-related lung diseases. Each project represented her attempt to apply the healing skills her father had taught her on a scale that could benefit entire communities. James's business ventures served similar purposes while generating additional wealth to fund their charitable activities. His mining consultations helped legitimate operators avoid the fraudulent practices that had destroyed so many investors, while his geological expertise identified genuinely profitable opportunities that created employment for frontier communities. "There's something else we need to discuss," James said, his tone becoming more serious. "Senator Whitman's office has requested a private meeting about territorial development funding. Apparently, our success has attracted attention from people who make policy at the federal level." Charlotte understood the implications immediately. Political involvement offered opportunities to influence territorial development and resource allocation, but it also meant greater scrutiny of their backgrounds and wealth sources. What kind of involvement are they proposing? Infrastructure investment partnerships, primarily railroad and telegraph expansion into undeveloped regions. They're seeking private capital to supplement federal appropriations. The proposal represented a natural evolution of their activities, leveraging their resources to support broader economic development. However, Charlotte remained cautious about exposing themselves to the intense investigation that accompanied major federal contracts. "Our cover story would need to withstand serious scrutiny," she pointed out. "Federal auditors aren't as easily satisfied as newspaper reporters." "True, but we've had 5 years to establish legitimate business records and references. At this point, our documented success speaks for itself, regardless of how it originated." Charlotte considered the opportunity. While walking to the library, where they maintained maps and documents related to their various interests. The room had become a planning center for enterprises spanning multiple territories, a dramatic expansion from their original treasure-hunting activities. The transformation in their personal relationship had proven equally successful. Their marriage, 2 years earlier, had been a quiet ceremony attended only by close business associates, but it had formalized a partnership that encompassed emotional intimacy alongside shared professional goals. "I have a confession," Charlotte said, as she studied the detailed maps covering their library walls. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you had never collapsed outside my clinic that night." "Different lives entirely," James replied, without hesitation. "You would probably still be practicing frontier medicine in some territorial town, while I'd either be dead or serving a prison sentence for crimes I didn't commit. Do you ever regret how it turned out? The unconventional path we've taken?" James joined her at the map table, pointing to locations that marked their various business interests and charitable projects. "Look at what we've accomplished together. Medical research that's saving lives, legitimate businesses providing employment, infrastructure development that's opening new regions to settlement and commerce. He gestured toward the correspondence covering Charlotte's desk. Your institute receives letters every week from doctors reporting successful treatments based on research we've funded. That hospital in Chicago will treat thousands of patients. And Yuli, the mining safety protocols I've developed have reduced accident rates throughout the territory. Charlotte nodded, recognizing the broader impact their partnership had generated. Their individual contributions might have achieved modest success within conventional career paths, but their combined resources had enabled achievements that transcended normal limitations. The ripple effects keep expanding, she observed. Each project we fund enables other people to accomplish things they couldn't manage alone, which creates additional opportunities for further progress. Exactly. Your father saved lives one patient at a time. You're saving lives by the hundreds through medical research and hospital construction. That's not a betrayal of his legacy. It's the ultimate fulfillment of everything he taught you. The perspective offered comfort while highlighting how much their influence had grown beyond their original goals. Recovering Vale's stolen treasure had been their initial objective, but that success had enabled them to become forces for positive change on a scale neither had previously imagined. As evening approached, Charlotte found herself standing again on the terrace overlooking San Francisco Bay. The bustling harbor represented American expansion and opportunity, forces that had shaped her own transformation from frontier doctor to wealthy philanthropist. Tomorrow would bring new correspondence from medical researchers seeking funding, business proposals requiring evaluation, and political figures hoping to secure their support for various initiatives. Their wealth had made them influential beyond the normal boundaries of gender and social convention, creating opportunities to shape territorial development according to their own values and priorities. Any regrets about abandoning your quiet practice in Copper Ridge? James asked, joining her as lights began appearing across the city below. Charlotte considered the question while remembering the woman she had been, competent but limited, secure but unfulfilled, respectable but unremarkable. That person seemed like someone she had known long ago rather than her former self. None whatsoever, she replied with complete conviction. Nursing you back to health was the best decision I ever made, even though I had no idea where it would lead. To extraordinary wealth, influence, and the ability to improve lives on a scale most people never imagine. To a partnership that's accomplished things neither of us could have achieved alone, and a future limited only by our imagination and determination. Charlotte Blackwood, formerly Charlotte Whitmore, had become living proof that single acts of compassion could generate consequences far beyond their apparent scope. Her decision to save a wounded stranger had ultimately transformed her into one of the most influential women in America, using wealth recovered from criminal enterprises to fund legitimate research and charitable activities that would benefit countless future generations. The story that began with a desperate man collapsing during a desert storm had evolved into a legacy of medical advancement, business innovation, and social progress that would endure long after the original actors had passed from the scene. Sometimes the greatest treasures weren't buried in desert caches, but discovered in the courage to risk everything for the possibility of extraordinary achievement. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.